Welcome to the Future of Wellness, exploring self-transformation and holistic healing to unlock your inner potential. Hosted by Christabel Armston and Keith Parker.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Future of Wellness. Today's topic is psychic development, sensing, and ESP, things that are of great interest to the world of energy healing and what we do at Field Dynamics. Our primary goal in this conversation is to explain how psychic sensing is not a hierarchy and not really a goal even. It's a developmental capacity that matures through balance, presence, and discernment.
Here we're going to be looking at interest in ESP and subtle energy. We're going to be talking about why it's important not to be in comparison with others, and also look at framing psychic sensing as more of a byproduct of inner work rather than an endpoint.
Working with subtle energy is central to energy work and energy healing, and many people are naturally drawn to this subject because it's mysterious, it's exciting, it is something which brings us into direct experience with the unknown. So we can understand subtle energy as a starting point, as an interface of sorts between body, emotion, mind, and of course, the interface itself is the field.
When we say ESP, we're not talking about spectacle or supernatural displays. We're referring to subtle shifts in perception. So this may be a felt sense, intuitive knowing, energetic tracking, noticing changes in the atmosphere, and subtle information that isn't arriving through the five senses in an obvious way. So this is a layer of experience where something might register with us, but often we can't quite point out why. So that's the territory we're discussing today.
This is the realm of subtle energy, prana, chi, as is discussed in the Eastern traditions, and sometimes people wonder what that is, what it's made of. And in general, we point people to electromagnetic fields. And whereas we have a physical body made of matter, we tend to just talk about energy as electromagnetic fields, that the aura, and there's more to it. However, for a simple general starting point, think physical is one level, and then non-physical, energetic is a more subtle and electromagnetic domain.
People are often very naturally drawn to this subject, as we see in our trainings and working with people in one-to-one sessions. There's something really compelling about sensing beyond our physical senses. We want to normalize that attraction. It makes sense that people are curious, but we also want to recognize that psychic sensing is not a ranking system, it's a capacity. And just like any capacity, we're able to develop that. So just like in a yoga class, some people will arrive to this very flexible and others will arrive tight. So development looks different depending on where you begin. But just like the aim in yoga isn't extreme flexibility, it's actually balance. And we can consider that our sensing develops in the same way. Some people begin very open. Other people arrive more closed, and neither is superior, but balance is the aim rather than extreme sensitivity. And we're going to be talking about this more shortly.
This presumption about I'm more sensitive, therefore energy work is more appropriate or suited to me is not actually the case. And that yoga example of being more or less flexible is similar to the idea of a person being more or less sensitive to energy, and both are great starting points because they have different kinds of balancing processes. Regarding energy healing itself, if people are interested in developing their sensing capacity, energy work is one of the best and most suited practices out there for that very specific reason, because as you practice energy work, which directly affects how your field is flowing, the feedback in your experience, the moment-to-moment interaction is all about reading subtle energy. So you might say that energy work is one of the best, if not the best, techniques out there for developing ESP.
Absolutely. Which brings us to why sensing matters in energy healing. If sensing is this capacity we're able to develop, why does it matter? So energy work is a direct interaction, right? It's involving us being in a continuous sort of dialogue with the subtle field. And over time, practitioners learn to become really familiar with that behavior. This might represent in different ways depending on a person's system, right? We often all have a leading sense, And that's something that might develop and change over time. But things to look out for might be a sense of contraction, softening, right? A temperature shift, noticing heat or cool, a pulse-like movement, or an area in the field or the body that feels very quiet and still, or conversely, like charged, dynamic. So this is sort of pattern recognition, if you will, developed through repeated exposure. It all becomes increasingly precise as we develop this skill set and lean more into our energy healing practice.
You could say it's of great value to developing ESP when you have such a reliable feedback mechanism and people who want to kind of distill, clarify, or experience how real, how visceral even subtle energy can be. A practice such as energy work really helps them to get in touch with that and have a developmental space to explore, experience, experiment, and learn.
Developing sensing is how practitioners in energy work and other disciplines are able to track shifts in their own system or in the system of the person they're working with, right? It's how they can essentially learn to respond intelligently to what's occurring within the field, what dynamic is happening, what change is taking place. So there is an important addition here, and that's regulation, right? Sensitivity without regulation, as it were, just becomes noise. And this can be where there's overwhelm. This can be where you can't track clearly. You're not sure what's yours, what's somebody else's. This is far more common than you might think. So sensitivity with regulation, with boundaries, becomes intelligence. So if your system is numb or overwhelmed, you're not able to track clearly. And sensing isn't about becoming hypersensitive. We're not looking to overextend. It's about becoming regulated enough, centered enough, clear enough in our own boundaries and self to be able to perceive accurately.
People are very often interested in the developmental arc of developing psychic abilities. And we like to use the word sensing. It's a cleaner word because psychic and ESP has a certain kind of attachment or association. It's really about sensing and expanding the senses that we have physically into subtle domains. So here's this idea with a yoga practice where we can mirror or use the analog of the physical body to understand how many people initially approach their journey of sensing development. And that is through flexibility versus inflexibility in terms of our physical bodies. There's the experience of coming to something like a yoga class and seeing that some people have to open up their body, have to become more flexible, versus some people are extremely flexible and they actually have to create more of a boundary. They have to create more rigidity or containment within themselves. And this parallels where many people are at when they initially approach energy work, is that some people need to open up their sensing capacities and other people actually need to create boundaries or strengthen their container to be able to differentiate all of the information they're already receiving.
Right. So just to get really clear with this, let's imagine somebody who can fold over in half without effort at all, right? In contrast to somebody who can barely touch their knees. So with that first instance or example, we're looking at what we might call oversensitive, people who are beginning extremely open, right? They're feeling everything. They're picking up emotional atmospheres instantly. They're walking into a room and their register is sort of shifting immediately. They might be merging, they might be over merging. These are people who are often identified as having a strong empathic resonance, a strong empathic response to circumstances. But as we were saying, that openness often comes with overwhelm. So there's a difficulty discerning what's truly belonging to them and a difficulty actually identifying what information is relevant, right? Everything's coming in, it's unfiltered. So our clarity in that instance is actually decreasing. So having that strong permeability is not the same as having precision. So high sensitivity isn't automatically equaling depth. And in fact, without regulating that, it can really obscure your perception, right? So development for this person in terms of ESP is not about opening further, but about tightening the system, boundaries, differentiation, containment, discernment, nervous system regulation. That's a big one. So we're learning how to modulate our sensory input and learning that our boundaries refine perception, they don't shut it down. So we're stabilizing and learning how to perceive without absorbing.
Yeah, that's really clear to see that oversensitive type as you're describing. And then we have the opposite, which would be the undersensitive, so to speak, person or the inflexible person. And this is where there is a dullness, if you will, towards sensing subtle energy, where a person might tune in, try and feel their field, try and feel subtle energy, and they sense only so much. It's either a little or it's minor, but it's not this huge amount of information or this continual tracking of changes and information density, et cetera, as in the overflexible person. So if the underflexible person comes, what they need to do obviously is open their perceptual channels to increase their awareness, to kind of stretch into things. And there is where kind of the edges kind of have to expand in a certain sense, like stretching muscles that haven't been used or getting into spaces in the body that have never been accessed before. It's a similar kind of parallel there again. And it's really interesting to see that the presumption of most people from the outside is that sensitive people are the people suited for energy healing, but that's really not the case in practice. It's that anybody who's resonant with energy healing is suited for energy healing. You just have to find what your kind of constitution and profile are, and then you have to develop and continue to sharpen, open, discern, etc. from there.
And I think it's really interesting to note, Keith, that latter archetype, as it were, what we're often seeing there at the personality level is a lot of doubt, right? A lot of doubt at their ability to perceive, and maybe even some comparison to others, right, who seem more naturally open, like something's wrong, or there's a less than, which is obviously very much not the case. Maybe it's natural here to bring this to the balance, the midpoint, the point of convergence, where either or of these extremes is able to move towards the same center. Extreme sensitivity that's obscuring perception, or extreme numbness that's obscuring perception. So in one case, there's too much signal, and in the other, perhaps not enough access. So maturity and development in this instance looks like stability, discernment, ease, and responsiveness, right? You're able to perceive, but you're not destabilized by what you're perceiving. And you can track, but your system isn't flooded. We're able to feel without being confused or overwhelmed. So the question might not be so much how much can you sense, it's how regulated are you while sensing. And regardless of where you start, what we see through the trainings and in our work with people is that the path tends to lead towards this balance, towards integration. And that's the developmental model that Field Dynamics is sort of proud to help support, right? Not hierarchy, not talent, just a maturation of this very natural capacity.
While ESP is a very attractive component to many people and these kinds of, psychic powers, if you will, it's a carrot. It's alluring, and understandably so. We want to exercise a little bit of caution here and say, yes, it's exciting. Yes, there's good reason to get into this, but at the same time, to have discernment, to have caution about what is the context of ESP and the overall developmental arc of a person's inner work.
There's something very powerful about having direct experience beyond the physical senses, like you're saying. When you're able to sense something more subtle, it's not requiring sort of faith or theory, but it's very experiential, and that can feel kind of electrifying. We see that with attendees when they're tuning into their sensing, this sort of connection to the sense of mystery, right? There's an excitement and a sense of confirmation, which actually is important, I think, that reality is maybe bigger than what we might have thought. So for many people, sensing can be the doorway into energy healing and similar practice. So it's the moment experientially where they realize there's much more going on here. And that can really ignite genuine inner work. Often sensing can be the beginning of something with much more depth.
And it's important that people don't take on a belief system with energy work. That is a big part of the ethos we've tried to put forward, is that there's no belief system being given in energy work. There's a lot of maybe unfortunate confusion in different communities and traditions about, the esoteric or what's sometimes called the woo-woo or the new age. But we're trying to really ground things in contemporary language and to show that direct experience is just immediately available on day one, where there's no belief system about energy work. It either works or it doesn't work in your direct experience, and testing it experientially is available. So subtle energy and kind of realizing these things are true, real, tangible, accessible all the time is a very wonderful thing. It's an encouraging thing, really, because it leads people into a knowledge-based foray into their inner being, not a belief based or, a somebody else told me that it is true, so therefore it's true, but rather I directly know kind of way of experiencing things. And that's really encouraging to me. And certainly, I think the place where we feel comfortable aligning ourselves and orienting an experience to offer other people.
I think maybe it's important here, or it'd be a nice segue into speaking on the traditional teachings, Keith, on the siddhis, because in many contemplative traditions, both the yogic and the Buddhist, unusual perceptual abilities are often acknowledged, right? They're not denied. But there's often consistent cautions or an emphasis on not orientating that way, right? Fixating. And I wonder if you could speak to a little about that, because it's an area that you're experienced within.
Well, generally in these Buddhist and yogic traditions, which have such amazing meditative prowess, they track what happens to people as they kind of open up their system and go deeper towards full healing, full awakening, full enlightenment, these kinds of things. And they very reliably track these things that they call the siddhis or the iddhis. The psychic powers or the attainments will be attained or experienced by people, and that they're not the end of the line. They're not the goal, is the point. Generally speaking, along the path of self development from this more inner kind of place, people will open up their sensing into these other domains of, in a sense, reality and self, in which they're going to see a bit beyond, a bit into what we might think of as supernormal domains. And what can happen is that can become a distraction. The abilities that people have, the kinds of domains that they can explore can be very attractive and very alluring. People can sometimes get derailed or distracted off of their path. So these Eastern traditions are very clear about what happens. They say, expect these things to happen. They will happen in time. However, don't be distracted, because the goal is not psychic ability. The goal is healing. The goal is awakening. The goal is enlightenment. The goal is freedom from suffering. And that's the reason that we partake in this inner journey in the first place, is to create more potential within ourselves, not to have these kinds of cool sounding psychic abilities.
Beautifully put. So in that sense, what we're really saying is that the doorway is very meaningful, right? For many people, it can be the spark, the carrot, but it's opening into something deeper than perception. That fascination with the ability, if we allow it to sort of soften and not bring a sense of attachment or identification to it, but instead just lean into the qualities that it connects us to, right? Greater regulation, greater discernment, ability to integrate best, embodiment, right? Greater embodiment. Then what's becoming more compelling in that instance, right, is the stability and the coherence that we're connecting to through that awakening path. There's something really important to flag here. Let's maybe say it quite plainly. Greater sensitivity does not mean greater spiritual maturity. And parallel to that, energy healing does not require psychic proficiency. So I think these two ideas alone can actually help relieve a lot of the pressure that people can bring to their energy healing practice. So there's often a subtle hierarchy that can form in these spaces. And it's the assumption that if I sense more, I must be more evolved. Or if I don't sense much, I'm behind. But both of these are distortions, of course, and sensitivity and maturity in how the system are regulated, as we've discussed already, are not the same thing. So when we strip everything back, we arrive at a really core piece, which is simply presence, right? Presence is the primary healing factor, both within energy healing and other parallel modalities. Presence is what helps us stabilize and organize the field. It's what helps us bring regulation and availability to our practice, both for ourselves and with others.
Energetic sensitivity is certainly, like you're saying, not the litmus test for spiritual maturity. We probably could reference something like that as, what is a person's ability to be present and to bring the best version of themselves forward, the most balance, the most peace, the most love, not what is their development level of psychic ability and stuff like that. And we see this really clearly. So that's important, in a sense, a myth or a presumption to debunk. And as you said, there's another piece, which is energy healing does not require any kind of psychic proficiency. A lot of people are interested in energy work and they'll say, "Oh, I don't sense energy very well, so energy healing must not be for me," despite being interested. And time again with people we work with, we see this kind of a profile. As we know, energy healing works regardless of your ability to sense subtle energy because the underlying mechanics don't require a sensitivity. Yes, sensitivity does add layers of interaction and certain kinds of more advanced skill sets, let's say, but the foundation of how energy healing works has to do with presence and intention, working with higher consciousness, and all of the things that we teach and train people how to do from the ground up. And so people are working with subtle energy, they're working with energy healing as a technique and a paradigm. They may not be particularly sensitive as a starting point, but they can do amazing healing work with other people. And we see this time and time again that presence as the foundation and a person's focused attention is going to be a recipe for effective and sometimes really profound healing work.
So I guess with that shared, Keith, what that brings us to is this question: if sensing isn't the goal, should we still be developing it? And the answer from the field dynamics perspective is absolutely. Psychic sensing develops as a consequence of bringing more presence, doing more practice, and regular, consistent engagement, right, with the subtle anatomy, with the scanning and tracking. And energy healing accelerates this quite naturally. So subtle energy work is incredibly transformative. It's integrating our physical, our emotional, and our mental layers. And we're learning to read the field. And reading that field and understanding the structure of it and the flow is what helps make the inner transformation tangible. The field is where these layers all meet and come together. So there is a lot of usefulness to working on developing that skill set.
With energy work in terms of psychic development, regardless of where anybody listening to this is on the spectrum, there is a developmental path towards the center in which your attunement and your discernment can go up significantly from wherever that you are. And generally speaking, we set up a training and a structure where we work with people long term because we understood from our own experience that these kinds of developmental arcs don't happen in a weekend or in a month, but they happen over the course of seasons and even years. And that's what the program that we've set up encapsulates is a container for people to develop the kind of depth with the kind of supported longevity that in many cases is what's required in order to kind of tune the system and open the system and develop these kinds of nuanced ways of either opening versus clarifying boundaries that are required for each individual. So it's important to make note that regardless of where people are starting, there is a path of improvement from every single place.
Which brings us kind of full circle back to that orientating framework, if you will, or question, right? Am I trying to perceive more or am I learning to be more available? What ultimately matters isn't how much you sense, but how available you are to what is here, right? How present. You've just outlined a little bit of how we go about sharing a framework for that in our trainings. People will be able to find more information on the website or connect with us for a chat if that's something that interests them. And of course, there are many other avenues if this is something that is interesting to you in which to explore developing your sensing. Yeah, it's a fascinating subject area and something I'm sure we'll return to and talk about in more detail in other episodes.
This subject of sensing, ESP, psychic development, again, these certain words are very exciting for people. It is one of the primary kind of magnets or subjects that people are most excited about in the world of energy healing, and for good reason. It puts us in touch with what is beyond, what is unseen, what is invisible, what is mysterious and profound about our existence. And that's exactly why it's a major subject in energy work, and part of the reason why it's useful in the practice of energy healing. It gives us a hook, it gives us a thing, a mechanism to connect to that feeds back into our direct experience to confirm that things are a bit different than we thought, that reality is a little more complex than we thought, that we ourselves are deeper and more expansive than meets the eye. And so developing sensing is this clear-cut way to give direct experience, to ground it, and to make it known so that people don't work through belief systems, but rather work through their own inner clarity towards the goal of holistic healing.
Just to add a note, I always like to mention this. This is useful sort of away from practice as well, right? Off the mat, as we might say, away from our energy healing protocols and practices and into the real world where having good discernment, having healthy boundaries, understanding what's ours and what's others is actually really helpful and conducive to a present, grounded, embodied experience in this life, right? Everything from this visiting the supermarket through to interactions with family and friends and environments such as the workplace. So really useful skill set to develop with a plethora of benefits beyond the scope of healing work, of course.
Yeah, that's a good point to add that this is applicable to life in general. As with most inner kind of cultivation practices, in one sense, meditation cultivates presence in its most distilled sense. And that, of course, gets carried over, quote unquote, off the mat into life in general. And the same is true for subtle energy, as you're saying, in that this is a kind of a layer or a sheath just beyond presence. And that is where our discernment of our subtle interaction with all things becomes more clear. And that's certainly a very valuable thing in day-to-day life.
So if you intuit or sense that you would like to learn more, do check out our website, upcoming courses, trainings, and workshops. And of course, we offer one-to-one sessions as well. Please do listen to other episodes of The Future of Wellness. We feature a lot of guest episodes with experienced practitioners and experts in the fields of consciousness development, healing work, and the future of wellness in general. Thanks so much for listening. We look forward to connecting again soon. Thanks for being a part of the Future of Wellness. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It helps us reach more people and to make great episodes like this one. Learn more about field dynamics and why we think the future of wellness matters. Check us out at energyfielddynamics.com. See you next time.